The words about human engineering and genetics had just spread far and wide ever since Gretnar got her adjustment. Many different species started to look at humanity as something other than what they biologically were, and a few governments, of course, wanted this technology for their own personal ideas, most of which of the ideas were nefarious in nature, and humanity knew this, which is why they held onto the technology very, very close. The fact that Gretnar was allowed to change was only due to the fact that she was the very first one to come to them and ask. And she asked, not just politely, but persistently. She had asked so much and in a way that was exactly in accordance with the way humans wanted to be approached that everyone simply said, sure, okay, let's do it. Not only that, but she ended up paying quite well for it as well. In fact, humans wanted to get their hands on a forced fighter craft for a long time. Their version of aerospace fighter was very interesting to look at, but they hadn't actually torn one apart and got a chance to look at one. And Gregnar was able to let them get their hands on one. This definitely helped relations out. And now, even though the Forced, many of their alphas, were not exactly happy with this, they understood that Gregnar was doing what was in best of their intentions. Due to this, they sat back for a moment and didn't cause too many problems. Even though Gretnar's father was known to be not happy with her transformation, she simply waited. And when they waited, it turned out that the humans had returned the aerospace fighter, reconstructed afterwards, and they had actually improved on it. They had improved the engines significantly, pushing out 80% more thrust, so much so that many of the Forced found themselves vomiting on themselves every time they pushed it to its absolute limits. They also found out that it was far more maneuverable, as just a few little tweaks from the humans had adjusted it. They started to wonder, what the hell were the humans? Were they geneticists or were they engineers? Whenever asked this question, the humans would simply say, yes. And now, inside the embassy, waiting for a Nashani named Femcast to be removed from her tube, many of her own kind actually sat and watched. As they waited on top of the hospital suite, looking down, Vince walked in, very nervous, as Femcast was his woman, his mate. They had been in a physical relationship for well over the entire semester. In fact, they met on the first day, and it was well noted that Femcast was a little attracted to him, but yet disgusted at the whole idea that he had fur on the top of his head. Vince, for his own doing, made sure that when he was altered, he made sure there was no hair anywhere else, except for the top of the head and the eyebrows, of course. And of course the eyelashes, but that goes without saying, as that's a universal through all species. Doesn't matter if they're mammalian, reptilian, aquatic, avian, it doesn't matter. They all have some sort of eyelash to keep debris out. While they sat and waited, a few of the parents simply asked what was going on. Other students were there as well, as they wanted to see the process. Femcast, even though she wasn't exactly the most modest of women, I don't know if she would like to actually be seen the way they're going to see her. Vince began to explain the process, with Larry and Gregnar right there, as Gregnar had actually been through the process themselves, but the fact of the matter is she was unconscious for most of it. As soon as they explained the whole portion of her being dumped out of the tube, rinsed off, and immediately the medical personnel making sure that she survives it, Femcast's parents got very, very nervous. So nervous, in fact, that both of them began to shake almost uncontrollably. Their gills began to move and flare out to the side. This was a sign of their own species of being scared. In many cases, this used to be a thing if they were scared that a predator was nearby. They would flare out to make themselves look even bigger, but nowadays it was more just if someone was nervous. Vince tried to do what he could to calm everyone down, joking the way he does. Oh, don't worry. She enjoys being watched. Believe me, because I enjoy watching her. This didn't go over with the family as very well. In fact, Femcast's father was more than a little upset. Upset not only that his daughter, well, one of them, had decided to shack up, for lack of a better term, with this hairless monkey that he was looking at, even though this hairless monkey was very, very large, almost twice the size of Femcast's father. He was still not exactly thrilled with her choices, though Femcast was her own type of girl, and they said as much. This was something her mother had said as they relaxed and relented. Eventually, when Vince reminded everybody that she would be dumped out bare ass in front of everybody, that is when the parents immediately started to tell folks, certain ones, to leave. The males of her species were noted to be aggressive when they saw a naked female of their species. It wasn't a problem back in the day when they were all swimming in the oceans and coming onto the shore to sleep. But no, now it was totally different. They did still have their version of modesty, even though it was, compared to humans, at least to these humans, very limited. Femcast wasn't known for wearing a lot of clothing, but she did wear it. With that, the only ones remaining was Femcast parents and some of the females there, mothers and sisters and so on, who were there to watch the whole idea take place. They wanted to get an idea of what was going to happen if they so choose to do this as well, as the word of all the great things that had happened due to genetic engineering. One of the females that happened to be there was Greknar, and she was completely inundated with questions constantly as they watched the suite be continually checked and double checked to make sure everything was ready. Greknar simply told them all of the good things that she had experienced. How she now had strange color eyes, but she still had the vision that she had when she was a complete True Blood force. Now, she also still retains her hearing, although due to that, she has to wear a goofy helmet whenever she goes target shooting or hunting, as the sound of gunpowder and lead is very unpleasant, to the point of being painful. This made a few of them wonder, because using kinetic weapons was not something most species did anymore. In fact, the Nashani, which were sitting there, were more along the lines of water-based weapons. They used a high-pressure system wrapped around a energy cylinder to actually propel water. When it came out, it forced the water to actually congeal, almost like ice, not quite dropping the temperature down, but forcing the bonds of water to stick together, at least for a while. What this would do is actually basically jab somebody with akin to an icicle. But because of that, the actual water would dissipate, leaving the wound to left be open and bleeding. This is one of the reasons why they were never actually assaulted, as they would simply jump onto a boat and take a whole bunch of the opponents out without them even knowing. The only ones who ever did something ever close was the Ko, but the Ko were very small compared to the rest. What allowed them to actually do anything of aggressive nature or military nature, depending on how you look at it, was the fact that there was just so many of them. They bred exceptionally fast, usually having broods of 5 or 6, and 3 or 4 surviving all the way to adulthood. It was rare to have a full brood actually survive all the way to adulthood, even with modern medicine, as the fact of the matter is the nutrients were never spread equally, and there was always a runt, and there was always one with a deformed feature. And if that deformed feature just happened to be somewhere in the gills or the tail, then they couldn't swim right, they couldn't breathe, and they were done. The Nashani didn't have to worry about this, as they could simply suck in water and spit it out through the back, just like most fish if they're in stagnant water. Though the main difference between the two is that fish are restricted to their fluid features. They were not able to actually go beyond anything that wasn't water. The Nashani were more amphibious, in truth, though they didn't end up being very slimy like you would consider a frog. And this was one of the reasons why everyone assumed that Vince had started to like Femcast so much. She had a very petite, feminine look, especially to that of a human. Those inside the room with Gretnar realized this when Gretnar let her know that she did not have the curves, as she said, as she moved her hands down her body. She didn't have the dimensions as she reached under and lifted her chest a little bit to emphasize this. She didn't have the extra muscle. She turned and raised her skirt a little bit and flexed her thigh muscle to show that she had more definition. And she joked and said that the humans call her thick, although Larry has never once said that. He just said that she is very shapely, attractive, and very, very, very hot. Which Greknar still doesn't understand. She never thinks she catches a fever, but whatever. She just assumes that it has something to do with attractiveness. The Nishani inside were worried that if Femcast became a actually true warm-blooded creature, very similar to human, then she might not be able to return to their oceans. If her skin was not thick enough to handle the pressure, they worried about this a lot. So much so that Femcast's parents again began to shake and their gills began to flare just a little bit. They didn't have time to think about it, though. As the final checks were being done, everyone got into position, and finally, the pod was brought into position. And with a sudden burst, everything happened. The bodies sliding out, everyone putting tubes in, putting wires on, hosing her off real quick, getting her in position, and everything else that needed to be done. All the Nishani there looked on in amazement, as they were no longer looking at one of their own. Femcast had decided to turn into something new, something interesting. Gregnar looked on and began to chuckle and laugh as she looked down at Femcast's form, who was not even awake yet. She was still coughing and gagging, but just like any other Nishani, every time she coughed, the lungs did not exactly shoot just out the mouth, but also launched water out past her gills. It turned out her gills were more towards the back of her head now. Her skin was still that same pale blue, yet she had far more human-looking features. The Nishani, none of them ever had tails, but they still were surprised at this. Though Femcast was very thin, she still had extra lumps and bulges around her that the rest of her kind didn't quite understand. Gregnar once again explained this was probably something she chose. They were all confused, and she had to break down the fact that before anyone chooses their new form, and they must choose carefully, as this cannot be altered easily, if at all. But they are given a list of items that humans find attractive, certain items that will aid them in what they choose to become. And with this, many of the Nishani looked down and began to ask again, why would she do this to herself? Gregnar just responded, isn't this obvious? I mean, seriously, isn't it obvious? As she motioned down towards Femkes as they were finishing up and beginning to bring her into the next room. With this, they simply went down to the recovery room. But the recovery room was blocked off, surprisingly. Security wouldn't let anyone through. Vince was more than a little agitated at this as he wanted to get in, along with Femcast's parents. They wanted to go in. They wanted to see how she was doing, and they knew if security was there, something was wrong. Something was very wrong. With that, they saw several other doctors and technicians start rolling in. They worried that Femcast had some sort of reaction. Is her new body fighting itself? That is a true danger. How did they alter her too much? Did they mess something up? What was wrong? They wanted to beat their way through, but the security pulled out their stun batons. Vince and Larry immediately start pushing everyone back as they knew the stun batons were enough to put them down on one knee, but they would most likely kill a Nishani where they stood. Nishani, just like many other species, cannot handle the electric shock. It's just too much. And many of these stun batons are turned up much, much higher, as altered humans can handle much, much more than you can think. It wasn't until Gregnar decided that she would show them what it would do. Before Larry had the chance to say, "Don't, wait!" Gregnar took a hit into the side, right next to her kidneys from a stud baton. She had told the guards to actually show everybody what would happen. She went down immediately and started convulsing on the floor. Larry and Jenny, who was there, immediately ran to her to see if she was seizing up, but in actuality she was just in severe pain, and her muscles were convulsing simply due to the fact that she had just gotten electric shock of over 70,000 volts. That doesn't feel good. Eventually, within a minute, Gretnar was back on her feet and rubbing the side where she'd been zapped. Larry checked her out, and of course she did have the slight burn mark, which he surprisingly could see healing itself. Grateful for this, he looked over at one of the guards and said, "Don't ever do that again." The guards looked at each other and then looked at him. "Wait a minute, aren't you the—" "Yes, I am," Larry snapped that. And then Vince stepped next to him. "And I'm going to say it too. Don't ever do that again." With that, the guards were immediately on edge and then immediately clicked a button on their wrist. With that, within 20 seconds, that is, other guards began to show up. It's not as though those outside the recovery room were actually trying to still push in, no, but the guards were a little bit more than wary. They still held position. 3 hours later, who was let inside? Femcast's parents, along with Larry and Greknar. They were all allowed in, but only for a short time. They didn't know why it would only be a short time. A few of Femcast's siblings wanted to be in there too, but they were told to just wait outside for a little while. As they went in, they could see Femcast as she was still a little groggy from all the anesthesia. They asked what had happened and why. It turned out that some of the readings were off, and they wanted to figure out what the hell was going on. The technicians were in there more to make sure her heart didn't just stop on them. They didn't have the zapper with the paddles or anything, which was old technology, but it still worked. And yet, they still wanted to make sure everything was good. What actually surprised them was the fact she wasn't breathing. And it wasn't until she had actually got into consciousness that one of them finally yelled, "She has gills, you moron!" In which case, she started laughing uncontrollably. At that point, they realized she actually was breathing, no matter how many times they tried to put air down into her. Every time they tried to inflate her lungs, she would just open her throat and just let the air blow back out. The air would, of course, go past her gills and she'd be fine. It was just the fact that they were trying too much. As this was the first Nishani to actually be worked on, it was questionable. The fact that she was also not mammalian had a big deal to do with it. It wasn't until later that they were actually told that every time a human had gone and tried to make themselves more aquatic, there was always issues. Always. Without question, there was always issues. They were just hoping that if it went the other way, aquatic species trying to be more human, there wouldn't be as many issues. They were wrong. Within 20 or 30 minutes, it was to the point where Femcast was asking if she could finally be discharged and go back to the dorms where she could rest comfortably. Her parents wanted her to go home, but Vince really wanted to stay by her side. And, well, Vince, being as large as he is, just really wouldn't fit in their house. He'd most likely break the door just opening it. Again, Femcast's father just kind of looked at him and said something along the lines of, "You giant monkey." Vince didn't seem to care, even if he did hear it. Yet, Femcast was also more interested in just getting up and moving around and testing her new body. She wanted to move around. She wanted to do some exercise again. She'd been trying to work out with Vince and Jenny, but she hadn't been able to keep up. Her Nishani body just was not able to keep up with the strength and endurance. And now she wanted to see if she could. Vince laughed at her. Hey, tomorrow morning, okay? We'll take you to the gym and we'll work you out and you'll see the big difference, okay? But for right now, we just need you to relax a little bit. With that, Femcast tried to fight it and then immediately sat up, exposing herself, not realizing the only thing she had covering her was a sheet. Before too long, she was put in the same type of garb that Gregnar really hated to wear when she left, but she still had to wear something. Then she was put in a elevated chair and brought down towards the entrance. She spent the rest of her day going to get something to eat and answering a whole bunch of questions, along with moving around, seeing how many new digits she had, how her new appendages operated, and of course, she wanted to look for a long time in a multitude of full length mirrors. Unlike Gregnar, Femcast was a bit more vain in her looks, and she wanted to see how her new body was. Needless to say, she was very pleased with what she saw. As it turned out, when Gregnar asked her, and of course Jen was inquiring as well, as they looked on her as she tried different things to include undergarments which she definitely did not enjoy wearing. They started to wonder if that was a human thing, undergarments. Yet they asked why she chose this. She simply stated that Vince had mentioned a game that he found one of the characters that was also her same color very attractive. They asked which game, and when Femcast mentioned it, Jenny proceeded to laugh until she had to relieve herself and simply ran off to the latrine so that she didn't piss herself. With that, Gretnar was left a little confused until she pulled out her own datapad and started to look it up. It took a little bit to get the spelling right, as it was a different language, obviously a human language. Yet they found it. Gretnar immediately looked at Femcast, looked at it, looked at Femcast, like, you have got to be kidding me. You're almost a spitting image. With that, Femcast simply smiled. Thank you, she said. I hope Vince will like it too. Yes, he will. And they realized he was outside waiting. Femcast, without skipping a beat, immediately ran out of the changing room and jumped into his arms. With that, Larry immediately looked at Greknar and then kind of turned away. He was trying to avoid any issues as he looked around and realizing that those two were making a public spectacle of themselves, not the smartest of ideas. With that, Larry simply put his hand on Vince's back and pushed him towards the changing room and simply whispered in his ear, "Don't be too loud," as he shoved really hard to get them on the other side of the curtain. Greknar and Larry left. Jenny came back and they passed by her and simply stated, "Yeah, you might not want to go in there for a while." She didn't even have to ask why, as there was a sudden squeal of pleasure that came from that area. Everyone in the entire area realized what was going on. Unfortunately, Femcast's parents were also walking back and heard that, and immediately they both turned many, many shades of green, their version of blushing, and were completely embarrassed. With that, also Femcast's little sister and a few other siblings were confused. What's going on? And were immediately ushered out. It became very, very well known within a week how humanity had the technology to change everyone's physical appearance via their own genetics, their own genetic engineering, something they call CRISPR, mixing in different points of 0 point energy frequencies to allow them to heal exceptionally fast. All sorts of cellular manipulation and gene therapies. It was just insane. They didn't tell anybody how they did it. Genetic editing was known through the universe at large. However, it was not something that was commonplace. For humanity, it was. And this This is what made a few of the other species very, very nervous. Talks began for this technology. Also, talks began to ban this technology from being used at any other space. They wanted to stop any of this from happening again for any species, even from their own. It didn't matter if it was a Vuncian, a Zeknekel, a Celtipsian, even. They did not want any of them to be genetically altered to become more human. It didn't matter how much the humans had shown that their engineering skills were unmatched. It didn't matter that in the games that the humans were almost untouchable. It didn't matter. They wanted this stopped as they worried that their own species would stop being their species and simply become human. For those that have totally got their asses kicked in the games, they did not want to become more human. The only ones that even thought about this are the ones who wanted to face the humans on equal footing. But the arguments would continue for months. During that time, the Vuncian were still trying to make themselves look not as big of an assholes as they were the previous games. The male that had smacked around Greknar really bad had been disciplined badly, almost to the point of wanting to off himself, hurting his own family name on that, and going completely off the reservation. They had known for a fact that they had lost. They had completely lost and they knew it. Yet, he still did something that was against the rules. Why? Revenge? Spite? Anger? It didn't matter what the reason was. He apologized profusely. The only one on his side that allowed him to be able to save a little bit of face was Greknar herself, as she reviewed the footage constantly, and so did everyone else. When there was a little bit of a trial, looking at the expulsion of the Vuncian male, Greknar was the first one to say, if you watch, even though she was unconscious, as soon as Larry had gone up and was getting ready to kick that guy's ass, and he realized that she was his mate, she was left alone. If in their society, if the mate is injured and the other mate, doesn't matter if it's male to female, female to male, doesn't matter. If their mate is injured and they are allowed to go up and help their mate. If they back the video up, they saw that another Vuncian male had been plugged several times by the paint pellets, enough that he went down with a bit of a thud. And yet, you could see a Vuncian female run out screeching the words, my mate, my mate, my mate, out into the open. You would think she would be absolutely covered in paint by the time she got to him, but not a single human fired at her. Not because she's female, but because they respected the Vuncian societal norms. Because of this, the Vuncian male who screwed up so bad was willing to take any punishment Greknar was going to give him, to include laceration, perforation via firearm, or anything else. Anything else to prove that he wasn't the biggest asshole that they had ever come across. Yet at that point, the only thing he got from Larry was a look of sheer contention. Larry had sorta got his revenge when he kicked that Vuncian male's ass. Something fierce. In fact, in a few spots you could still see that the Vuncian bore the scars from the strikes of steel-toed boots. If you looked at his mandibles next to his jowls, you could see that the crack had formed and not actually sealed itself fully. With this, tensions between the Vuncian and human were tenuous, at least for a while. Vuncian males being so large, and the fact that most of their own society is based off dominance, this was just something that happened every so often. Eventually, though that male would be removed from the academy, the entirety of the Vunshan population would not receive any additional punishment, as they did not break the rules. With that, of course, the Vunshan male did hold its head down quite low as it exited the area. It didn't want to be pushed out of the academy, as this would mean that he not only brought shame to his family and his species, but his own personal life was pretty much over. It was not until that Vunshan finally went next to Larry and simply stated something along the lines of, "You have my most severe apologies. I lost myself. The rage, it, it took me over. There's no reason for that. All I can say is, I'm sorry." And as he went to leave, Larry softened for a moment and called for the judgment to be overturned. They asked him why. Larry simply stated, "The rage that took him over is something us humans have to deal with all the time. It is something that happens. Mistakes happen. We can accept this to be a mistake that will happen one time and one time only," shooting a glare at the Vunshan as he turned over with a shocked expression. "One time, and that's it." He looked over at the Vunshan ambassador. "Do you understand this? We will clear this incident. It will remain as a stain, but not as a scar." This was a saying in Vunshan society. The difference between a screw-up and a fuck-up. The Vunshan ambassadors looked at each other and immediately agreed, and with that the judgment was given. The Vunshan male actually dropped down and began to kiss Larry's feet, which immediately forced Larry to back up. He was confused. "Hey, what are you doing? What are you doing?" He didn't realize that this was also a part of Vunshan society. When someone owes another, when they owe them their lives, they are now their servants and will kiss their feet. Larry immediately told him that you will never follow through on that. Just stop being an asshole. With that, the Vunshan just acknowledged it and was told to leave. They didn't have any problems with that after that. However, problems did arise. The Zeknekel were not exactly thrilled with any of this. Also, the Cultipsian, a very strange species, as you would look and kind of wonder exactly what in the hell they were. Were they bears? Were they dogs? Were they lions? They were clearly some sort of bipedal creature with a very long tail that they drug around. Very lumbering behemoths, although they weren't much bigger than humans. They still would scare the living crap out of a Ko if they walked next to them, and usually didn't say much. They kept to themselves a lot. The large tusks and fangs that they had, yes, they had both, were nothing compared to the two sets of eyes on either side that seemed to move independent of each other, moving around trying to look through the fur that seemed to drape over past them, yet it was not thick enough to cover the eyes. The large snout that was there that moved forward made them almost seem like a bear face was underneath, yet it was like a sheepdog dripping over the front. Normally, they walked on two legs, with the fur dripping all the way down to the point where you would be hard-pressed to actually tell where the legs are except for the movement. They did not care much for the humans. They would have challenged the humans, yet they were smart enough to realize that they would not be able to hide. They weren't fast as the Forced. They wouldn't be able to hide. If they were spotted, they would be immediately picked out. They weren't small enough, like the Ko, to sneak through an area. They weren't able to wiggle in and out of an area like a Zegneko. And they couldn't breathe underwater like a Ko or a Nishani at all. But they, above all else, believed that their race was the strongest and the best. And the fact that other races were not looking at them with fear and not looking at them with awe silent awe and amazement at this giant creature that was always top of its class. Yet now they looked at the humans. Now they looked at the humans and they didn't go to a Celtipsian and ask them to work on engineering projects. The Celtipsian were known for their engineering. They were exceptional engineers. They could grab a coat hanger and a doorknob, and 2 days later, they'll build you a nuclear reactor out of those items alone. It was incredible what they could do. But now the humans had put a stop to this. The Celtipsians were also known for their strength, their ability to move large amounts of equipment, but now the humans with their ships, their automation, were able to move even far more. It was hurting them financially. Many of the other species were almost completely against dealing with a Celtipsian if they could deal with a human. They would alienate the Celtipsian, and this made them angry. This made them irritated, even though the human space was not close to theirs. It was enough that it was a true drain on the economy. They worried that the humans would end up forcing them into bankruptcy, forcing them back into their own borders, unable to get any type of work beyond their own. They looked into those that were next to them. These would be the Zeknekel. The Zeknekel didn't care much for the humans ever since they lost the games very badly, and their space did border up against the humans. The Zeknekel and the Celtipsian started to barter with each other in the shadows. They began to alienate the humans, as neither of them really cared for it. The Zeknekel, only once did they send someone to the embassy. Only once did they ask what the humans could do if they wished to be adjusted. And the human ambassador simply stated, "To whatever you want." The Zeknekel asked if they could be changed completely to human. And when the ambassador simply said, "We can get you 98% there," this was enough for the Zeknekel to be afraid. Afraid that they too would lose their ability to be their own species, that everyone would eventually want to become human. And this whole idea was more emphasized as several dozen Nishani wanted to be changed into the same way Femcast was changed. Everyone was amazed by this. Everyone couldn't understand why Femcast was being so, shall we say, she was getting a lot of attention, mostly from human males who simply wanted to observe her up close. Human males, the fact that they were coming from their own area that was beginning to explode in commerce, seemed to be the more prized for the females. In many of the species, the females must find the best male they can. And not only that, they must impress said male, as most of the males did not survive all the way to adulthood. In fact, very few ever did. In forced society, it was normal for one alpha to have 7, 8, or 9 of their own female mates around. Greknar's mother was one of those. She had to deal with one alpha that was shared between 7, to include her mother, different females. This one male had command over that entire area. The more females they controlled, the better. But this meant that females had to fight for the best males there. This tended to piss off a few of the human females, yet some of the human females began to look over to different species as well. As soon as a few of the Nishani males were changed, it was freakish. To the human eye, all the Nishani seemed to look very, very similar. It was actually kind of creepy to most. If you didn't know what you were looking for, you could easily confuse one for another. However, Vince never had that problem. In fact, Femcas asked one of her sisters. That was immediately changed to kind of swap places as their skin tone was almost identical, and Vince was able to tell them apart instantly. This let them know that they would be able to lock down a single human male and not have to share them. However, this led to some surprise instances, as it was almost impossible to tell the males from the females as soon as they were adjusted. Well, until you got to the point where clothing was not an issue. Along with that, several of the forced actually went and wanted to be adjusted as well. The difference is that many of them wanted their fur to be a different color, a different shade. Not just the deep brown that most of them were, but also the red color, seemingly Gretnar had decided, but also a lighter color, almost pink. Some of them wanted something to be blue, but that was not really possible as the pigment would not be created in their body. Some of them wanted a more earthy, almost green, which was doable, and others simply wanted solid black. That was definitely available. Others, to most surprise, wanted a very, very bright blonde. It was surprising. And when this transformation was done for the first time with the blonde hair, that was the first time some of the forced males started to pay attention to the transformation. As it turns out, most of the forced female didn't realize that it was commonplace for forced males to prefer blondes. Maybe they thought blondes had more fun. But the humans didn't know, nor did they care. They were getting paid well for these. The Co were looking into it, but not a single one actually chose to do so, as they were mostly human shaped already, as they wanted to stay the way they were. They had no interest in being in any type of relationship beyond that of business with the humans. The Vunshin thought it would be a good idea to try and get one changed into something more akin to a human, but the human ambassadors told them that it might not be the best of ideas. They didn't understand why until they were shown what the adjustments would make them look like. It was enough to make both the humans in the room and the Vunshin shimmer. They were just shaking with disgust at the idea of what they would end up looking like. Maybe more efficient, perhaps, having hands, several dozen hands going down the body, along with a strange tail that seemed to wrap around not quite a lizard, but that of a dragon, and that having the head change more human shape, but they would still have their mandibles and jaws. It was not something that was aesthetically pleasing. So the Vunshin would just wait. They simply left with one message. When you figure something else and you could do more adjustments, let us know. With that, everyone was on pretty safe terms. At least. And to truly patch things up, Larry let Vince know that he would be gone for a couple of days and grabbed himself a shuttle. He had made plans to have dinner with Gretnar's father.